Hello, everybody. My name is Luis Carlos Niño. I'm the Director of Analytics at Thomas Murray. Welcome to our webinar on how to rob a bank and not get away with it. I'm joined today by my colleague, Johan Peters. Johan?
Hi there. Good afternoon, everyone, or good day, depending on where you are.
And now, before we carry on, I'd like to just talk 2 seconds about Thomas Murray and who we are. We are a company based in London, and we have more than 30 years of experience producing risk analysis, detailed risk analysis on multiple type of entities and organizations. We cover a variety of firms from central security depositories to global custodian banks and other entities in the financial sector. And we have since around 2020, we've been working tirelessly on our technology side on a new area of business where we are now exploring and understanding better, providing a special insight into the cybersecurity vulnerabilities of a particular organization. And in this area is where I like to hand over the microphone to Johan Peter, who is the Managing Director of our cybersecurity service. Johan?
Fantastic. Thank you, Lewis. So just setting some background. We're a new team to Thomas Murray, but not really a new team. We have a huge amount of experience in things like incident response, forensics, acting as expert witnesses in court, all the way through to helping protect our clients. So things like running simulated attacks against people's infrastructure, testing security controls so that ultimately you don't need me turning up on Monday morning trying to help you unpick a massive fraud, which we'll talk about today. All of the work that we do is based on our knowledge of everything bad that happens in cyberspace effectively. And that links into our Orbit security platform. So all of our knowledge feeds the platform, and we use the platform's knowledge to feed our services as well. So it's a unified approach. Really briefly, the backgrounds of the team are from fairly varied organizations, but hugely experienced, some from government, some from military, consulting, and so on and so on. So, how to rob a bank and possibly not get away with it, partially get away with it maybe. It's a bit of a maybe an addition to the pension if that was possible. But we'll talk through some incidents today that are based on real events that the team have responded to, and we'll talk through what happened, how it happened, even who did it, which is kind of unusual in a cyber incident to actually identify somebody. So this is pretty much the old school approach, and you probably agree that it's limited in scale and lacks ambition. You can only do this a couple of times before really you get caught, and unfortunately you're unable to then continue that enterprise. It's probably better to work comfortably from a secure location with a team of experts. And organised crime these days has an amazing structure, has leadership, it has IT specialists. There are people who specialise in breaking into certain types of business, certain areas of the world, language skills. There are people who specialise in gaining initial entry. Then there are people who are specialised in the activities after that entry is gained. So the actions on target, what are they trying to achieve? In the case of a fraud, how to affect that fraud, take the money out, clean the money and return it to something useful, meet the objectives. Where there's a ransom demand involved, there's even generally a help desk that people can contact to help people use Bitcoin typically and pay ransoms and receive decryption keys and so on and so on. In some cases, it's a billion-dollar industry, which is quite scary from that perspective. and really well organised. The team that we'll talk about today are even more organised in that they even had hotel rooms in certain locations, claimed expenses, and so on and so on. So really employees of an organisation. So let's prep for a bad day at the office, and hopefully it doesn't happen to you, but it's increasingly likely that it does, frankly, at some point. So IT reports that some servers are unavailable. The infrastructure of the bank is limping effectively. Some of the services critical to the business are not available, and they're having a pretty stressful time as people call in via the help desk to ask, what's happening, when's it going to be fixed, and so on and so on. You tend to find in this kind of event that IT are just flooded from every single direction with people asking what's happening, when's it going to be fixed, and not leaving really time for IT to actually understand and fix the problem half of the time. In this case, the lights were still on, the bank was available, people could still call, they could still attend a branch, which was fortunate, and it was just an IT problem at this point. But reconciliation failed overnight, and it failed by quite a lot of money, in the tens of millions per incident in dollars. There were SWIFT transactions that resulted in a major movement of funds out of the bank. It was above the normal AML limits and the kind of AML limits that you'd expect on location, amount, frequency, etc. The transactions themselves were identified against valid maker and checker accounts. So if you're not familiar with SWIFT, basically a team needs to create the transaction, and a very separate team then needs to authorize the transaction for it then to pass through the AML infrastructure and actually result in a transfer of funds. There's then a 24-hour period while the funds clear the process, basically. They found in this case that the transactions were created in each instance by valid maker and valid checker accounts. So it looked like the employees had decided to plan for their pension early and transfer very large amounts of money out of the bank. And enough time had passed for the transactions to clear. So that 24-hour window, which is critical, had passed. And the reason it had passed is because the adversaries had taken advantage of time differences across the world to make sure that they transferred money at the correct time out of a source to a destination for that window to pass before the reconciliation happened and the fraud was discovered. And given time, days actually, to pull the SWIFT transactions and to conduct some analysis, it was really interesting. The yellow parts of the graph are where the transactions were created, and the purple are where the transactions were authorized. And it's really close together. It doesn't look like a human interaction. From our perspective, it was pretty perfect, so no errors, no mistyping anything. And it looked suspiciously automated, even though there were real people, according to the software and the logs available, behind the creation of the transactions and the authorization of the transactions. So we're going to have some fun and conduct a bit of a poll. If we could have the first poll, if that's possible. And if you'd like to select the answer you'd recommend, we can see, how this pans out. So would you immediately interrogate the people involved? Because, clearly the software says that real people created the transactions and authorized them. Would you suddenly remember the holiday that you booked and set you out of office and leave as soon as you can? Or would you try trigger your crisis management procedures?
Guys, waiting for some of the opinions of our attendees.
No one's booking a holiday. It's very disappointing. One person's booked holiday. Now that's comforting to know.
Uh,
So fantastic. We'll close
so,
that there. But
yeah, I got a question from one of our
yeah,
attendees. He's
sure.
asking how exactly can they vote? So the there should be a panel to on the right hand side to be able to allow to for you to vote.
I can.
There are three dots on the right hand side bottom, and there is something called polling. Then you can see how you can vote, the different options to vote. We've got we got still one more minute on this particular vote. When we know that from the answers, 36 people said they would trigger the crisis management response. That's clearly the majority by a wide margin.
I'm with the
Sorry.
person that's booked the holiday and said the out of office. Sounds like a strategy. And actually, answer A is interesting because you do need to talk to the people involved, and depending on where you are in the world, that might mean a formal HR process to invite people to an interview, to sit down to try and discover what happened and how and when and so on. But it is answer C, obviously, trigger the crisis management, which usually results in a whole host of activities. So to go through the actual activities that happened in these cases, because they were very similar in the ones that we responded to. So the central bank was notified. There were some very urgent calls to the destination banks to understand if the funds had been moved from their initial destination and to try and freeze those funds. That was actually really quite successful in all of the cases. They managed to freeze and recover a good majority of the fraud. Staff were indeed questioned, so it was kind of right. It just wasn't probably the first thing to do. To understand where they were when the transactions were created, were they sitting at their desk? Was there any CCTV that monitored that environment that could back up their statements? Were there any logs from access control that indicated where they were in the building? And so on and so on. IT incident response was triggered, but it wasn't that effective. Just because IT is scaled to support the operation of the infrastructure day to day, rather than deal with a crisis which needs some fairly particular skills. So they augmented the internal resources with external. In these cases, interestingly, they actually contracted quite a few different parties simultaneously. So there was more than one investigating team, which initially was a bit of a mess. It didn't have a clear direction, and there was a risk of people destroying evidence as they sort of trampled over each other in trying to do the right thing.
Even we have one question.
Yeah,
Somebody
sure.
asked whether the Swift bridge was before or after the GPI became mandatory.
I am not just a banking expert, so I don't know. We can come back to that if you take a name loose
Okay.
and find out. These were around 2019, 2020, 21, those kinds of time frames, if that's helpful. Internal messaging was deployed, so it's really necessary to control the message at all levels, because staff are answering the phone, interacting with the external world. You don't want the message spreading that there's maybe something bad that's happening. Meetings behind closed doors, IT systems unavailable. In some cases, really obvious things like email missing and so on and so on. So it's really important that there's a holding message and people understand how to behave. Some thought also needs to be given to external messaging. So if the information becomes public knowledge, what are the statements going to be? Preparation is really key for this because it needs to be factual, but it also needs to provide enough information to be trustworthy so that people don't react badly to the news, but also maintain a level of confidentiality around the investigations so that the organisation, in all cases, not just a bank, can decide the right order to tell stakeholders what actually happened based on a factual investigation, not making statements that then later have to be retracted, which is a really difficult place to be. Also, regulation is an issue. So often investigations are conducted under legal privilege to protect the working documents of the investigation, so that when the final report is created, that's the shareable authoritative document rather than the thoughts and the investigations that happened along the way, so that the narrative is well defined, it's factual, and it's released in a controlled way. So early messaging from a crisis, if it becomes public knowledge, is an art, and it usually needs some external expertise. And for those of you that did book their holiday, in one case the CIO decided he was still going on holiday and made a one-way trip, actually, never to be seen again, which was the first and last time I saw that. So when you employ a team such as us to conduct an investigation, we take a pretty structured approach that integrates with the board of directors, the resources of the company, the culture of the company, people's thoughts and fears at the time, because it's a really emotive event. It's generally people's worst day in the office. We engage with the board to shape the response so that some order to the chaos was brought, especially with lots of different resources from lots of different teams and suppliers involved. The board ensured that contingency measures were taken to keep the lights on, so plenty of cash in the ATMs behind the counters in the branches, and they wanted to basically mitigate against the run of the bank should the news make the press and then a negative spin being taken on that news. In actual fact, the fraud in all of the cases we engaged with didn't endanger the bank at all, but perception is everything, and they wanted to be sure that they were in a position to move against those kinds of sentiments. I talked a bit about the multiple suppliers, but we made sure that there was order to the chaos and that evidence was preserved, because without the evidence, we wouldn't be able to find out what happened, who did what, when and where, how did they get in, what was the ultimate actions that they took, and are they really removed from the environment. We deployed tooling to gain really good situational awareness, and also engaged with the tooling already available at the bank. So we have specialist kits basically that gives us really good visibility into what's happening in the technical environment. And we also fixed some problems in some of the technology used by the various banks so that we could access the logs, the security logs that they had rapidly. And also we understood the perimeter of the network environment, which was actually surprisingly difficult. In one case, the bank had lost control of the totality of its infrastructure, so it had more means of remote access than it understood. It had more laptops and mobile IT than it thought initially. And we really had to work with the bank to really understand the perimeter of the network environment, so that when we devised a strategy to remove the adversary from that environment, we could be sure that they didn't have a way of getting back in. Otherwise, you end up playing a game with the adversary that literally lasts possibly for months if they're motivated, to really be sure that they're out of the environment completely and forever. So, quiz time again, another poll. Would you then try to find out if somebody got in and compromised security from the outside? You've already interviewed the internal staff involved, but the maker-checker transactions looked quite close together, a bit too perfect, if you remember. Would you continue to examine the testimony of the users, because they're authenticated with two-factor authentication, which is pretty bomb-proof? You know, everyone really uses that to access their bank these days, and it's in common usage and it's trusted. Or would you look at the wider context and try and build a timeline of events to try and find out what happened? What do you think? I can see people voting for A. So getting in from the outside. And lots voting for C. It's interesting, actually. The question of insider threat is a difficult one to answer commonly, because an external threat often uses the same kind of access as internal staff have to conduct their actions on target. So being really careful about interviewing people, preserving evidence, looking at the wider context like the building, security logs, CCTV is really, really quite important sometimes. So the majority of you voted for C. So look at the wider context and build a timeline. Yes, an investigation does take time, sadly, which is often a frustration when you're in the middle of a crisis, trying to deal with the crisis and dealing with the impact of one. It takes a while to filter through the evidence, gather the facts, make sense of the facts. And really, it's a process of moving from known events forward in time and backwards in time to find out what the initial event was that triggered the whole chain, and then the evidence to support the last event, so you can be sure that there's nothing else waiting in the pipeline ready to happen. So a timeline is a good way of establishing a good idea of the truth. And I say an idea of the truth because it depends on the amount of evidence available. It often isn't a perfect science conducting this kind of investigation, because we're conducting forensics and trying to find events that take us back from the point at which we arrived, which obviously depends what's left in that environment for us to look at. Understand the entry point. If enough evidence exists, often adversaries try to disguise the way that they access the network, and they also try and find other ways of accessing the network when they potentially lose access from the initial entry when that's discovered.
We have a question from one of our attendees. One is asking if they can do all three simultaneously: trigger and investigate. Triage and investigate.
Triage and investigate. Yeah, all of this typically runs in parallel, and it feeds each other and it goes around in a circle. So the initial investigation discovers some facts that might feed communication to staff, maybe external communication, and all the actions to keep the lights on. It might then discover more information so you can stem the bleeding, and then more information again to try and corner the adversary into a part of the technical environment so you can get rid of them completely. And all of that sort of happens cyclically, and more information becomes available every time you go around that circle. You need to adapt the business response against the technical response, the regulatory picture using external consultants like lawyers, maybe external communications, crisis communications people, and so on. So it's an ever-evolving picture. So yes, it definitely all happens at once. It's part of what keeps my job interesting. The next activity is to understand the tools, tactics, and procedures deployed by the adversary. So this really helps understand, potentially signpost who they are. So if you can understand who they are, what threat group they belong to, because researchers track threat groups across the internet, you then gain some insight into their previous behavior, their kind of capabilities, technically, procedurally, if they've asked for a ransom, how they've behaved in general. If it's a ransomware event, for example, and there's an intention to pay the ransom because there's no other choice to recover the business, then it could be a question, have they behaved honourably in the past? Have they returned access to the encrypted data once the ransom's paid, and so on. So that's really useful to look at the behaviour of the adversary, and sometimes it's necessary even to watch the adversary in the environment so you can gather enough information to be able to get rid of them and keep them out on a permanent basis. So ideally from this picture you can build a story, if you like, a narrative, and that's really helpful to differentiate between insider and external threat. In this case, there was damage to the IT infrastructure. So even though the staff were logged in using two-factor authentication, their own accounts, and in theory it shouldn't be possible for anyone else to log in as them, there's some damage to some servers across the infrastructure. So how did that happen? It's a bit weird that it happened at the same time as the massive fraud. So things like that need to be brought to the surface and investigated. And as I already said, all of this builds into a picture where you can effectively eradicate the adversary from the environment completely and establish containment, which is a major milestone in this kind of investigation. And also identify the kind of remediation actions that need to be taken to treat the root cause. So how did this happen in the first place, and how can we prevent it from happening again? Unfortunately, in one instance, the news leaked. So how would you feel if this was suddenly on the TV in the corner of your office? It's a pretty heart-stopping moment. And it was really clear in this case that the gossip in social media and in the press had originated from inside the investigation, which was really unfortunate and very unusual. So in that context, some more fun. Would you try and find out the person that leaked the information and expect the police to bring them in and interrogate them and find out what happened and why? Would you hold an investigation of the investigating team? So you can try and find out who leaked the information and what the motivation to do that was? Or would you deploy that crisis comms that you've hopefully been keeping warm in the sidelines and try and take mitigating action through sharing some information, some truthful information, whilst, you know, reserving legal options against people when it becomes known as to what happened?
Yeah, all the answers are at the moment are going. Oh, there's a couple of answers on option B, but most of them are going on the deploy the crisis communication as mitigating what's considered legal action.
It's difficult, isn't it? Because on one hand, you need to find out what happened and why. You know, you need to be able to trust the people who are looking into the incident completely. But at the same time, you have a bank to rescue at the end of the day and a reputation to maintain. So the answer is indeed C. If any of you noticed a pattern, I apologise. It was only after I created this deck I realised it was always C. I have to change them for next time. Anyway, the ideal answer is to launch crisis comms in a structured way. But what actually happens, for those of you who voted that elsewhere, is A and B. So they did investigate the investigating team, They did pull some people in off the street using the police for interrogation to try and find out what had leaked, why it had leaked, to prevent it from happening again. But ultimately, it was a massive distraction away from actually resolving the crisis at the bank. And it probably set the real investigation back by 3 to 5 days, roughly. So it was a huge distraction. Crisis comms are a really effective way of controlling public sentiment, how people feel if it's done well. So, for example, in one major case of ransomware against a big multinational broker, it became public knowledge that they'd suffered a massive ransomware event which could have destroyed the whole company, actually. So they were in real jeopardy, and crisis comms took the feeling in the newspapers from stupid broker, yet another one, falls victim to the hackers, to brave broker stands up to the hackers, doesn't pay ransom. It really changed the tone and brought time and trust to deal with the issue, and changed the way that the client dealt with their stakeholders, their regulators, and so on. It was really, really effective. Unfortunately, it needs generally some external advice unless you have some really good people internally and a bit of practice, which is not useful if you're doing it for the first time in a real investigation. And I've already talked about the tension between sharing information from an investigation, which needs to be factual. You'll only have a partial picture when people want the full answer. With the ultimate account of the event that needs to be given to a regulator, so financial regulator, data protection regulator. Maybe you have contracts with confidentiality clauses so people take legal action, so it's presented in court, and so on. So the jigsaw puzzle needs to be very carefully created so that the story is entirely factual always, and allows time for a proper investigation to happen before the entire event is known. And the release of that information needs to be controlled so that the timing is maintained accurately. So that, for example, if you have a duty to notify a regulator immediately, or after 72 hours or within 72 hours in the case of GDPR, for example, the regulator doesn't find out what's happening from the newspapers. They're notified first, and that message is tightly controlled, and everything that's released externally is coordinated. So, findings. This is a sketch of our report, which was quite thick. But ultimately, the adversary had discovered an interesting way of covering their tracks. They basically conducted vandalism so that they broke the servers just as they exited by detonating a bomb effectively inside the network. So they destroyed the ability of the servers to reboot, and then they rebooted them so that they just died. With time, we discovered we could fix that pretty easily and get the bank up and running. But it took some days from us initially engaging, gaining access to the evidence, understanding the evidence and doing some analysis to come up with a remediation plan to say, hang on, you don't need to restore from backup, we can actually restart all of this. But in tension with that, we also needed to understand the activities of the adversary, because if they'd had left something behind in that environment that we're just restoring, then that could detonate at a later point in time, or re-establish external access for the adversaries into the bank's network, for example. So the investigation to gather all the facts was really critical in understanding the kind of decisions that we needed to make to restore the infrastructure. And in turn, that drove the time, because fixing the vandalism of the adversary was quick and easy. Restoring from tape and reconfiguring the environment would take weeks. So a big difference in impact. We discovered that the adversary had modified the AML limits, so it doesn't look very likely that this is an insider threat at this point. To modify the AML limits, to conduct the vandalism, and to affect the fraud, all within the same timeline. Almost definitely an external threat actor. But did the insiders help the external threat actors? Another question to ask. Well, in this case, we discovered that they'd modified the application to bypass the two-factor authentication, but managed to keep the functionality enough so that when people logged in, the information in the application logs suggested that they had logged in using a legitimate account with two-factor authentication. So again, trying to hide the tracks and deflect blame elsewhere. And we also discovered that the staff were not at the desks when the fraud happened. So in comparison to building logs, CCTV, etc., they simply weren't there. And probably the adversary had been looking for a point in time where they could affect the fraud. They had a high degree of confidence it would succeed, and they wouldn't be discovered in the middle of doing that fraud because they needed that 24-hour period to pass for the payments to clear. So how on the earth did they do that? Two separate examples from different investigations, but example one involved a senior member of staff who'd been given a shiny new laptop by a supplier as a present. They'd been using that laptop at home. They didn't think to install antivirus or anything like that on it. It didn't meet bank standards. And they unfortunately had some malware on that laptop. They brought it into work. They created their own Wi-Fi network to attach that laptop to the bank's network. And it's very likely that the people who'd implanted the virus, looking to probably gather personal information and conduct, very small-scale fraud, suddenly realized that they were inside a bank and sold their access to the bank to another party, who I'll come to in a second. It's likely that all of their Christmases happened at the same time when they made that discovery. But effectively, that individual had bypassed all of the bank's controls and brought the adversary into the environment. In a second example, the same adversary actually used a very advanced technique to find a flaw that no one knew about yet within a Microsoft platform called SharePoint, which is used to present information to the internet at that point in time. And they tunneled their way through that flaw and the externally facing software to gain access inside the bank. And unfortunately, the bank hadn't really segmented their environment, so built walls internally, which had to then be passed to gain access to the crown jewels. It was a pretty flat environment that people could just move around at will. The adversary then used IT admin tools already available in that environment, which didn't really trigger any suspicious actions or detections in the security software, to move around that environment quietly and over a period of time. And they discovered the Swift servers. They accessed the Swift servers and discovered that the bank wasn't actually using them to create and authorize the transactions. They had another platform as part of core banking to do that. So they actually reset their strategy, went to discover where those transactions were being created and authorized, and instead attacked those systems. They took a long time to gather the correct picture before triggering their strategy, which was then implemented very rapidly on site to affect that fraud.
There's a question. Actually, many questions in there from one of our attendees. They're asking, was the antivirus system in place? What happened to the monitoring logs, and the user analysis? Was the reconnaissance period long? Is the days, weeks, months? I think there's quite quite a few questions there.
Yeah, no problem. So I'll answer it in the next slide, actually. Remediation. In all cases, there were security logs, there was a SOC, there was a process of gathering the logs together, correlating against separate events to try and discover the adversary. None of the banks had EDR tooling, so the kind of tooling that we use within an incident to discover malicious behavior and to stop malicious behavior. Antivirus, yes, they absolutely had antivirus, but antivirus is only effective as is a SOC that just using correlation of events against known bad things. If you have an adversary using unknown bad things, then those platforms aren't going to result in a detection unless you get lucky. So unless you find unusual access from a different country where it shouldn't be, for example. EDR tooling gives you unparalleled insight into an environment, but it also takes some skill to hunt through that data for threats. In some cases, the SOC could have been more effective. We had to fix the core platform, the seam used by the SOC to gather and correlate logs in one instance before we could use the data, because it gathered so much information, it was just unusable. The performance was dreadful. So they definitely had security controls, but what they hadn't done is test them, which leads me to some conclusions in a second. But we'll revisit that question and make sure I got everything. So the banks made some extensive investments in staff. They brought in additional expertise and rebuilt infrastructure using more acceptable practices against today's level of external threat. They deployed new architectures that segmented that environment, so built the walls that the adversary would have to pass through to give the bank a chance of detecting that unusual behavior of somebody breaking through those walls. They put new network controls in, like the EDR tooling that I just mentioned. They secured flaws in existing software, so everything was updated. They changed the architectures I've already mentioned to segment the network and so on, and really improved the monitoring in all cases. Did I catch all of the question there, Lewis? We'll come back and just check. So who stole the cash? It's really unusual for me to put my head above the castle wall and name somebody. In the world of cyber, it's really easy for people to hide their tracks and pretend to be someone else. But in this case, there's enough evidence to be able to pin it on a particular threat group. And that threat group is called Lazarus. If you have access to podcasts from the BBC, there's a really interesting, very well written podcast on the Lazarus group, which is an amazing listen, and I really recommend it. It's available in most places that podcasts are available. We can only say this because of the volume of evidence available from the various attacks across the banking sector, targeting SWIFT in particular, but also other kinds of attacks against other major targets, including defense networks and so on. So the FBI called Lazarus Group a North Korean state-sponsored hacking organization. So this was a means for for North Korea to evade the sanctions against them and achieve and gain cash, basically, to run the country. It was one of quite a series of attacks at the time. They also did things like denial of service against other governments that they were not friendly with, various other threats from thefts, even from banks, including the Bangladeshi bank, which was a huge fraud. And also stole a lot of information from defense contractors and various other sources which were useful to the mission of the state. So 2020 vision, looking backwards. Um, the key thing that would have prevented this from ever happening is the simulation of threat. Had the banks taken the time to really simulate activities of a determined adversary in a thorough way, they would have discovered the kind of flaws in their network environment which allowed access, allowed movement around the network, and avoided the security controls which would have alerted the bank to their presence. So that was the key thing that they should have done in hindsight to avoid this event from ever happening. Gaining better situational awareness or better tooling and using threat intelligence, because it's likely that the adversaries access to the bank in one example had been advertised for sale, so maybe that could have been found. And better security monitoring, which I've talked about. Also preparation for crisis. So many central banks are now mandating this activity so that the board of a bank or any large organization for that matter practice for a crisis, including and especially some kind of sophisticated cyber attack that affects the either the funds of the bank or its ability to operate, or people's trust in it effectively. And a crisis simulation would have brought order to the response, and it would have shortened the time that it took to recover from the event, because people would have a muscle memory on how to behave, quite simply. So that's it. That's how to break into a bank. So apologies that it probably won't result in bolstering your pension fund, but hopefully it was interesting, if nothing else. And it gives a good illustration of the kind of things that we respond to, but also the kind of services that we can offer to help protect from these kinds of situations by using things like orbit security to look at your external footprint presented to the internet, to having good security monitoring inside the environment, to conducting things like simulated attacks and simulated crises at board level and so on. So I hope that's been interesting. Were there any other questions, Lewis?
Cannot see any questions popping up, but this is what if somebody's typing. This is fascinating stuff, and really interesting. A bit scary. Some things how they are. There's innovation behind ways to try to get inside, and how we all need to remain inside, and we are super brilliant on this. I think there's a hand raising up somewhere. Let me just take a look. Uh,
Yeah, the
yeah.
really scary thing
Are
is
the slides
the
going to be
imbalance in the
shared? Has
relationship.
been asked. We're gonna rotate the material in a PDF to those who sign up to and attend this webinar. Um, yeah, thank few some of the attendees are just thanking the thanking you, Ian, because this is indeed fascinating. It's very interesting.
Really our pleasure. And I guess the scary thing is the inequality in the relationship. So an adversary only needs to be lucky once. People
Yes,
defending
yes.
an infrastructure need to be lucky all day, every week, every year.
It's
And it's a
relentless, and
definite
there's no
challenge.
breaks, there's no holidays, there's no
No,
off time. Yeah. Well,
not really. So buy your security team and your IT team a coffee next time, because they for sure need it.
yeah,
But I hope that's been useful. We'd love to do more webinars, so keep an eye out for future postings. And
absolutely.
thank you very much for coming today. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Jan. And thank you everybody for joining us today. It's been a pleasure. My name is Carlos Niño, and this is the end of our webinar on how to rob a bank and not get away with it. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a good day.
Take care. Bye bye.
Bye bye.